Welcome to Figments of the Brain, a philosophy podcast recorded at the University of Cologne. Figments of the Brain is produced by Concept, the Cologne Center of Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian tradition. Every episode we pick a topic for a roundtable discussion among the members of Concept. Sometimes we also interview other philosophers on a selected topic. We welcome your feedback. To get in touch and learn more about the center, please visit www.concept-phil.de. That's www.concept-phil.de. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
Hi everybody, welcome to Figments of the Brain. This episode of our podcast presents a recording from a new digital series organized by Concept called the Cologne Knowledge Router. As many of you already know, epistemology is a study of the nature and extent of knowledge and rationality. And on the router, we present the work of leading and up-and-coming epistemologists on topics across traditional, social, and formal epistemology. Now, in each meeting, an epistemologist delivers cutting-edge research, and the Concept Research Group, together with our guests, analyze it in an engaging and interactive discussion. On November 12th, we were thrilled to host Professor Liz Jackson of Ryerson University. She talked to us about her work on dilemmas, disagreement, and belief, credence, dualism. Have a great time listening.
I just want to start off by saying thanks so much to everyone for coming. Great to see you all. Basically, I want to start off by just summarizing kind of the old school, very basic disagreement debate. And this debate, one way you can see it is it sort of centers around this question: what should you do when someone who is smart and well-informed disagrees with you? And sort of in very broad strokes, we're going to talk a lot more about how we can kind of make this more specific, but in broad strokes, there's sort of two main views on this question. The conciliationist view says that when someone who's smart and well-informed disagrees with you, you should change your opinion in some way. And the steadfast view says that no, actually when someone who's smart and well-informed disagrees with you, you can hold fast to your previous opinion. And this debate, at least initially, centered a lot around the concept of what's called an epistemic peer. And this is roughly someone who is your epistemic equal, or someone who's epistemically on a par with you, is what I have on this slide. And normally epistemic peers mostly share evidence. They're basically the same, have the same reliability about the question. Some people define it as, you have similar epistemic virtues, but basically someone who's your epistemic equal. That's what an epistemic peer is. So one way to sort of see this question then, this main question about disagreement, it's the question of whether you should alter your opinion in some way when you encounter a disagreeing epistemic peer. And I want to argue today that we have good reason to say both yes and no to this question. And this leads us to a kind of epistemic dilemma. And then I want to offer a solution to this dilemma, so spoiler alert. That solution is that we should modify our credences, but we need not modify our beliefs in response to peer disagreement. And then I want to give three motivations for this solution. The first has to do with the different roles that belief and credence play. The second has to do with the content-attitude distinction, and then the third has to do with the concept of epistemic peerhood itself. And then I've sort of rebranded objections as frequently asked questions. Some of these are kind of more question-y than objection-y, but it's kind of objections. So three frequently asked questions is, well then when should we give up our beliefs? What about the Lockean thesis? And then what about the restaurant case? Some of you probably know what that is, but we're gonna talk about that. And then what I want to do at the end, if there's time, is sort of briefly apply my view to the question: what attitude should we take to our favorite philosophical views? Okay, so let's start off with the dilemma from Disagreement. And Laura Bushak has an awesome paper. It's actually forthcoming in Phil Review, so if you're interested in this, I highly recommend you check it out. And this is similar, although not exactly the same, as how she frames this. And the thought is that both of the following, 1 and 2 on this slide, have intuitive appeal. And there's some sort of intuitive appeal to the idea that our opinions should change when we encounter peer disagreement. This is the intuition behind what we were calling conciliationist views at the beginning. And one case that is often given to motivate conciliationist views is Christensen's restaurant case. So you're at a restaurant, you're trying to figure out how you should split the bill. You like do the math, you get 42 each, and then your friend does the math and gets 47 each. And Christensen's like, look, it seems weird if you're just like, nope, it's 42, and you don't take the fact that your friend, who let's say is, you know, equally good as math at you, as your kind of epistemic peer in this case, if you just kind of ignore the fact that your friend disagrees with you and just go with the number you got, Christensen says that seems odd, and actually that seems kind of epistemically irrational. You should change your opinion when you encounter that kind of disagreement. And in general, I think conciliationists push that, look, it seems kind of dogmatic and even close-minded to just ignore our peers' opinions. I mean, remember, these are people that have good evidence. Their evidence is similar to ours. They're reliable. They're epistemically virtuous. And it's not clear, like, that it's totally rational to just ignore it when one of those smart people disagrees with us. So that's kind of some motivation for why there is, I think, intuitive appeal to the fact that our opinions should change when we encounter peer disagreement. But on the other hand, and I think this is partially why, you know, there is this debate in the disagreement literature, there is a lot of intuitive appeal to the fact that, or to the thought that our opinions shouldn't change when we encounter peer disagreement. So this is the intuition behind what we call the steadfast views. And I think there's a couple different ways that steadfasters sort of argue that we can maintain our opinions even in light of peer disagreement. The first is just, it seems that we can have opinions, and even strong opinions, about controversial matters. And on the conciliationist view, you're either going to have to say, like, all these controversial matters, like, the people who disagree with me aren't really my epistemic peers, which seems weird. That seems a little questionable. Or you just can't have strong opinions about things. And that, to some people, that doesn't seem like a great result. And related to this is what some steadfasters have called the spinelessness worry. So Jamie Fritz is someone who I cite here, but Fritz focuses on moral disagreement, but I think it can apply even beyond that. And the thought is, if you're just constantly changing your opinion whenever someone disagrees with you, there's something that seems spineless about that. It seems like you're not really standing up for your views or the way you see the world. You're just kind of being tossed around by other people's opinions. And I think there is something kind of unattractive about that, especially when it comes to, you know, like an important moral commitment you have, or an important, you know, political commitment you have, that kind of thing. And then third, and I think this is a very interesting literature, there is this growing literature on the epistemic benefits of disagreement. And I cited some people there. There's also a number of people kind of in the philosophy of science literature who talk about this as well. But there's been some interesting results that show that when a group has people that genuinely disagree and has members that are defending hypotheses that I think a lot of the other members think are very unlikely, or views that those other members don't hold, that actually makes it more likely that that group will reach the truth in the long run. So that's just one of the many benefits that the people that I cite here talk about. There is important epistemic benefits of having a group that isn't kind of all on the same page about everything. Okay, so we're sort of faced with this dilemma. It seems like our opinions should and should not change when we encounter peer disagreement. But what I want to note here is, when we've been talking about our opinions, what should our opinions do when we encounter peer disagreement? And opinion is actually ambiguous between two mental states, belief and credence. And those of you who know me, this is one of my big areas of research, is belief and credence and their relationship. But belief is traditionally the attitude that, traditional epistemology has been concerned with. And most traditional epistemologists sort of see, there's a proposition, and there's basically three main attitudes you can take towards it, at least if you've considered it. You can believe it, you can withhold on it, and you can disbelieve it. So in this sense, beliefs are sort of coarse-grained, this tripartite model. There's three attitudes you can take towards a proposition. But formal epistemologists, on the other hand, have focused more on what they call credences. You can think about credences as sort of like a precisified notion of confidence, but they take your confidence level in a proposition and then give it a value on the interval from 0 to 1, where 1 represents maximal confidence something's true and 0 represents maximal confidence something is false. So in contrast to the belief framework, where there's basically just 3 attitudes, credences give you in principle an infinite number of attitudes. So they're much more fine-grained than beliefs. And the view I want to focus on here, and I'm going to give some motivation for this view in a little bit, but I don't have time to like spell out all the different views between belief and credence or give a full-fledged defense, but the view that I like and I'm going to focus on here is called belief-credence dualism. So this is the view that belief and credence are independent mental states. We have both, and neither reduces to the other. So if you think we have both beliefs and credences, then this actually gives us a lot more options in the peer disagreement debate. So instead of just saying, should we be conciliationists or should we be steadfasters, those 2 options, we actually have 4 options. So maybe peer disagreement should change both our credence and our belief, neither our credence nor our belief but not our credence, and then our credence but not our belief. So I think this is kind of interesting, because what's cool about these last 2 options, where we're changing one attitude but not the other, is that this enables us to capture the intuitions behind both the conciliationist views and the steadfast views. We can acknowledge and give weight to our peers' dissenting opinion. We don't have to be, closed-minded or just say, I don't care that even though you're smart and well-informed, I'm just going to ignore the fact that you disagree with me. But at the same time, we don't have to be spineless. We don't have to lose these epistemic benefits. So I should probably say more here because of the time. I unfortunately can't, but I hope you can see, I think this is kind of an initial motivation for the view, is that it can enable us to capture, I think, intuitive things about both parties in the disagreement debate. What I want to do now is I want to provide sort of 3 additional motivations for my picture. And specifically, a lot of these motivations will show you why I prefer the view on which we maintain our belief but lower our credence to the view where we maintain our credence but change our belief. But as a sort of preliminary motivation, I also think 4, which is the you change your credence but not your belief view of disagreement, it also can provide a solution to the self-undermining problem for conciliationism. And that's the problem that, well, let's say you're a conciliationist. Lots of smart people who are probably your epistemic peers disagree about conciliationism. And so if you see this, so it's like, if you're a conciliationist, it seems like you can't hold conciliationism because you'll have to conciliate with the smart people that aren't conciliationist. So if you see that as a problem for the idea that we can't rationally believe conciliationism, then I think my view offers a nice solution. You should lower your credence in conciliationism, but you can nonetheless continue to believe conciliationism. Okay. So now I'm going to give 3 additional motivations for this view. The first motivation is actually also a motivation for belief credence dualism. So this is kind of a common one that a lot of dualists give in the literature. I cite Rostam Schroeder here. Laura Bushak, I think, is also sympathetic to this kind of thing, maybe Julia Staffel as well. But that has to do with the different roles that belief and credence play. So a lot of dualists think, well, the reason we have both belief and credence is because they both have distinct and important roles to play kind of in our epistemic and mental lives. And there's a lot of other roles, not just the ones I put on the slides, but here's 2 of them that I think are especially kind of important for our purposes. So the role for belief is that belief enables you to kind of take a stand on something. It enables you to have a view of the world. And, like you could take like a trivial thing, like it's raining tomorrow. When you believe it's raining tomorrow, you have a view of the world that it's raining tomorrow. You sort of taking a stand on the truth of that. You could take a non-trivial thing, like, abortion should be legal. When you believe abortion should be legal, you can take a stand on that and have a view of the world. And some dualists have argued that because of the way that credences leave possibilities open, compare, believing abortion should be legal to having a 0.9 credence abortion should be legal. The second attitude, it kind of leaves open this possibility of error that the belief attitude doesn't seem to. So because of this feature of credences, it's not clear that credences can enable you to take a stand or have a view of the world, but it seems like beliefs do. So for more on this, see Ross and Schroeder's paper called Belief, Credence, and Pragmatic Encroachment. Some of you are probably familiar with that. But I think a lot of dualists think this is an important role for belief. On the other hand, the role for credence is that credences enable us to sort of track our level of evidential support for a particular proposition. So credences change via kind of conditionalizing on new evidence as we encounter evidence for or against some proposition. And what I think is important to note is that on almost all views, not even just dualist views, every evidential change in our credence doesn't need to change our beliefs. So you can take a case where you check the weather tomorrow and there's a 90% chance of rain, so you believe and form a 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow. Then you check it again later and that chance of rain has gone down to 85%. So you'll move your credence down slightly from 0.9 to 0.85, but you continue to believe it's going to rain tomorrow. I think this is a pretty standard view. Obviously, it's philosophy. Not every single person holds this, but evidential changes can move our credences around, at least in minor ways, without changing our beliefs. And that's sort of a view that almost everyone holds. So again, the role for credence is that it sort of tightly tracks our level of evidential support, and beliefs are just sort of too coarse-grained to do that. Okay, so that's sort of my first motivation. Let me say something briefly about disagreement. I think why this is important for the disagreement debate is that part of what the spinelessness worry is getting at is that if we're just conciliatory across the board, it doesn't seem like we can take a stand. It doesn't seem like we can have a view of the world, have controversial views. And if we are steadfasters about belief, then I think it's clear that beliefs, like if beliefs play this role, I think it makes it clear how we can kind of capture what's intuitive behind steadfastness. But at the same time, when someone disagrees with you and you get a little bit of evidence that you're wrong, or a lot of bit of evidence that you're wrong, your credence can kind of track as your level of evidential support for a proposition goes up and down in the face of people that disagree with you. Okay, so that's motivation one. Motivation two has to do with the content-attitude distinction. And the problem here is that it's just hard to see. So if you did want to say, like, let's be conciliatory about our beliefs, it's just hard to see what conciliationism is going to look like in a belief framework. So if you take kind of the most just like basic case of disagreement, I believe P, you believe not P, right? Then maybe we should both withhold. Okay, that's like the most basic case. But what if you believe P and I withhold on P, or you disbelieve P and I withhold on P? And you might say, well, if you believe P and I withhold and we're epistemic peers, then we both believe probably P or something. But the problem is that that doesn't tell us what attitude to take towards P itself. And so the worry here in general is that the tripartite belief framework, it's just too coarse-grained to capture even basic cases of conciliationism beyond like one person believing P and one person believing not P, and then, them being roughly equivalently confident or whatever. And that's even assuming you should kind of split the difference with your peers anyway. So I just think we only have three attitudes. We can't capture basic cases of conciliationism, assuming we're sort of holding the proposition in question fixed, which I take most people in the disagreement debate to be doing. And so what's cool about credences is they're just much more fine-grained than beliefs. They give us a lot more options. And so we have a lot more flexibility when we're conciliating with a peer. And what's great about this too is that we don't have to commit to a basic like split the difference view. People have raised a number of worries for this view, but we can kind of adopt different updating rules and sort of talk about like what's the best way to respond to peers. Conditionalization is a good rule, although Eastwarren and some other people have a paper some of you might be familiar with where they basically argue that both conditionalization isn't super informative when it comes to disagreement, and also it just gets really complicated. So they offer a different rule they call UPCO, which is kind of it's supposed to mimic conditionalization in most cases, and then they also talk about ways you could modify UPCO to deal with kind of more complicated cases. But the overall point is here I'm not necessarily going to commit to a specific rule about how we should change our credences in response to peer disagreement. But the point is just that they give us a lot of flexibility. We can, experiment with a lot of different rules and sort of see what the best rule is here. And beliefs just don't do this. Beliefs are just way too coarse-grained. So that's sort of the second motivation for my solution. And then the third motivation has to do with this concept of epistemic peerhood that we mentioned at the beginning. So remember, an epistemic peer is basically someone who's roughly your epistemic equal, someone who you're epistemically on a par with. And a problem that some people have raised for this concept is the idea is that a good peer is hard to find. And this is actually the title of Nathan King's paper, some of you might be familiar with. But King basically says, like, look, let's just take a basic definition of peerhood where you share evidence and you share reliability. He might have one more condition in there, I forget. But just take the evidence condition. Finding someone who just shares your evidence is actually really difficult, especially because evidence kind of includes, experiences you had growing up, background beliefs, that kind of thing. It's actually really hard to find someone who does share your evidence. And even if you say loosely share your evidence, I think it's still hard to find people in real life who basically have the same evidence that you do. And see the King for more on this. He gives an example with, Peter Van den Wagen and David Lewis, and some reasons to think that they really don't share evidence. And that's just the evidence condition. So many people that you disagree with, they're probably also either slightly more or slightly less reliable than you on the topic. So, Christensen's restaurant case, we both do the math and get a different number, and then maybe you got an A in math and I got a B in math, and it's like, well, maybe you're slightly more reliable than me. So I guess we're not epistemic peers, we're still close, but there's definitely, some difference in reliability there. And then again, people might be slightly less epistemically virtuous. They might be slightly less drunk, etc. So, so it's hard to find someone that's really a good epistemic peer, that's really epistemically on your level. A lot of people are probably slightly more, slightly less of whatever the condition is. But I actually think that this point isn't super important in the long run. And that's because the lack of peer disagreement, it just intuitively, it doesn't mean that conciliationism is never appropriate. Consider the case where there's someone who's slightly more reliable than you or has slightly better evidence. That doesn't mean you should just be like, you're not my peer, so I shouldn't conciliate, right? And in fact, you should probably conciliate slightly more because they're slightly more reliable. Maybe not way more, but maybe a little more. And then take a case where the other person is a little bit less reliable than you or has slightly worse evidence. It doesn't seem like that's grounds to just totally dismiss the fact they disagree with you. You should just, not conciliate quite as much. And then when it comes to experts, you might defer or mostly defer to them. And then if someone's a novice at a topic, you might mostly disregard their opinion. But I think focusing a lot on epistemic peers, maybe that's useful for sort of some theoretical, to find some general theoretical principles. But in real life, there's going to be kind of a spectrum of people that disagree with you, and some are they're going to fall in different places on the spectrum. And probably what we should do is, depending on where they fall on the spectrum, conciliate more or less with them. If conciliationism is true, of course. So one point is conciliationism just doesn't depend on the existence of perfect or idealized epistemic peers. But the reason this is relevant for our purposes is because, again, if you want to be a belief conciliationist, beliefs are just way too coarse-grained to capture, literally, it seems like all the belief case can capture is when you're perfect epistemic peers, and then one person believes P and one person disbelieves P. But beliefs are just going to be too coarse-grained to capture any of these other kind of more specific cases, people that fall at different places around the spectrum. And what's cool about credences, again, is they're just more fine-grained and more flexible. And so we can, use a disagreement updating rule that takes into consideration both the nature of the disagreement and then to what extent they're a peer or not a peer. And so I think credences provide a flexibility for updating that can capture different levels in epistemic peerhood that beliefs just do not. Okay, so I'm gonna check the time really quick. Wow, I'm running long. Okay, so I just wanted to recap very quickly. We had this dilemma from Disagreement. We talked about a way that a dualist could solve that dilemma, and I suggested we should change our credences but not our beliefs in response to disagreement. And then I actually technically gave 5 motivations for it, even though this says 3. So the first one was that it solved a dilemma. The second one is that it helped with the self-undermining worry. The third was having to do with the roles of belief and credence. The fourth had to do with, I'm going to cheat, contents and attitudes. And then the fifth had to do with epistemic purehood. So I'm probably going to go over these very quickly, but I wanted to answer a couple of the frequently asked questions about this view. So one question that I think is important to address is, when should we give up our beliefs? And what about cases of iterated disagreement where a lot of smart people disagree with you on some matter? Well, when we should give up our beliefs depends on whether the Lockean thesis is true. And note that the Lockean thesis is different than belief credence dualism. Belief credence dualism is just a descriptive claim about the reducibility of belief and credence. The Lockean thesis is a normative claim about the relationship between rational belief and rational credence. So a dualist can totally accept the Lockean thesis. They can also reject it. And I think dualists are divided on the Lockean thesis. But yeah, again, the Lockean thesis says that S rationally believes P if and only if S has a rational credence in P above some probabilistic threshold. So you might say it's rational for you to believe P if your credence in P is above like 0.75. Or you could have a Lockean thesis on which the threshold varies with context or with stakes. So if you are a Lockean, then when you should give up your belief, so when you should give up your belief depends on whether the Lockean thesis is true, and if it is true, what the Lockean threshold is. And in this paper, I actually don't want to take a stand on whether it's true, and I'm just going to talk about a couple different options, and then the commenters are going to push back on this a little bit. But if the Lockean thesis is true, then when you should give up your belief will be when it falls below the Lockean threshold. If the Lockean thesis is false, then you could actually potentially hold on to your belief for quite a while, even when you're encountering iterated disagreement. So sort of strong steadfasters might have some motivation to deny the Lockean thesis here. Most people who aren't Lockeans think that the kind of evidence matters, not just sort of the probabilistic amount. So if you're not a Lockean on one view, then when you should give up your beliefs will happen when you sort of get the right kind of evidence against your philosophical views. And if you don't have that view, but you're also not a Lockean, it's just going to depend on your background story about how rational belief and rational credence relate to each other. I'm going to, I think, say more about this hopefully in a second. I'm going to skip this one. I think these are cases that people give to put pressure on the Lockean thesis, and I thought it would be cool to sort of motivate some of the reasons people think that rational belief and rational credence are more independent than the Lockean thesis suggests. But I'll just say this: if you are inclined to go as far as, Martin Smith has some cases, there's John Hawthorne, and some people have this racehorse case where you go for the most likely of the live options, even though the probability of that is I think they have it as 0.4 or something. So if you go this far, you can get an even more steadfast version of my view, where your credence can go quite low, even below 0.5, and nonetheless you can continue to believe the proposition in question. Okay, another concern that some people have brought up that I think is important is, well, what about Christensen's restaurant case? How does your view deal with that? It seems weird to just continue to believe it's 42 and lower your credence that it's 42. It seems like you shouldn't continue to believe in that case. Well, first thing to note is if you are a Lockean, and I think in the case, you just sort of do the math quickly, so your credence in the initial proposition isn't going to be super high, then we'll have the result that you should probably give up your belief relatively quickly in this case. If your initial credence is rationally high, you've probably thought about this more. You've probably double-checked your math, maybe done it in your head and on a calculator, etc. And I actually think in this case, it is okay to hold on to your belief in face of disagreement. And then, yeah, you should maybe lower your credence a little bit, but you can hold on to your belief at least, in the face of one or even two disagreeers, because you've done the math and you've double-checked. But another way you could modify my view that I think is kind of interesting is John Pittard has a book that just came out last year, and what he does is he focuses on what he calls cases of deep disagreement. And this is disagreement that's concerning propositions that are at the core of your web of belief. So, you know, moral propositions, political propositions, maybe religious propositions. And on his view, we should treat those propositions differently when it comes to disagreement than propositions like we each owe $42 at this restaurant. And so what you could do is, if you were you wanted a more conciliatory version of the view, you could say that we should fully conciliate when it comes to non-core matters, but then when it comes to these core matters, we can continue to hold on to our beliefs even for quite a while. So that's another way you could kind of modify the view that I think is interesting. Okay, so briefly, just to sum up my view of disagreement, the weakest thesis that I take myself to have defended is that when one encounters disagreement regarding matters at the core of one's web of belief, we can say that's P. One should lower one's credence in P, but may continue to believe P. And then you can strengthen this by applying it to matters outside the core of one's web of the belief. You can also make the claim about belief a requirement rather than merely a permission, especially because the belief might be required to get the benefits of disagreement, the epistemic benefits of disagreement. So especially if you like some kind of epistemic consequentialism, you might want to make this claim about belief a requirement. And then you can lower the lock-in threshold. The more you lower it, the more controversial that will be, but that can allow you to remain steadfast in your belief for longer, even as your credence gets lower and lower. And then you can also deny that there's a lock-in threshold altogether. And then what that picture will look like, again, will depend on your view of the relationship between rational belief and rational credence. But on that picture, you could get cases where one's credence gets quite low and nonetheless one can rationally continue to believe. Okay, I only have like a minute left, so I'm just going to talk really briefly. That was actually sort of one paper, and then what I want to do is kind of write a second paper where I am bringing in this view and arguing that this view of disagreement can also apply to the question of what view philosophers should take to their favorite philosophical theories. So the question isn't what view do they in fact take to their favorite philosophical theories, but what view should they take? So I want to argue that philosophers can believe their favorite philosophical theories. It's at least rationally permissible to believe them, but they should have like a middling or even low credence in them. So why should they believe them? Well, I think it's natural to think that we can sincerely and rationally have views in philosophy. And by have views in philosophy, I mean believe certain philosophical propositions. And just thinking about myself, I do think I actually rationally believe most of the views that I defend. I'm not just kind of accepting them to play like this philosophy game or something. And I also think the person that says we can rationally believe our philosophical theories, they can give a good story about why it's rational to sincerely defend these views and sincerely assert these views. And this is much more puzzling for people who say we can't believe our favorite philosophical theories. I want to note too, this doesn't mean it's rational to believe every view you defend in philosophy. I actually have a paper that came out recently where I'm defending a view I don't hold with a friend, but it's because I think that view is underrated and people dismiss it because of objections very quickly. So this doesn't mean like I should believe that view necessarily, but I do think there are certain sort of core views that are our views, and it's permissible to believe those things. And I think too, for the opponents of this view, their claim is that it's irrational to believe your favorite philosophical theory. I mean, that just seems so strong to me. That just seems like it's a very strong claim. And so for me, at least, it's hard to accept a claim that strong, that it's actually irrational for me to believe my favorite philosophical theory. The reason I think that you should have a middling or low credence in your favorite philosophical theory, first, just like all the disagreement stuff we just talked about, obviously disagreement is one of the big challenges to our favorite philosophical theories, and credences are much more suitable for kind of conciliationism with smart philosophers. Also the rules for belief in credence, so it seems suitable to kind of take a stand on our favorite philosophical views, and this can help us as a philosophical community be more likely to reach the truth in the long run, like we talked about the epistemic benefits of disagreement. Whereas credences can sort of track your level of evidential support. So I think they're more suited for, again, conciliating with smart people. And then also the fact that you have a middling or low credence in your favorite philosophical views captures the idea that it's irrational to kind of be dogmatic or closed-minded, especially about something as controversial as the views that you should have in philosophy. So I might just kind of skip this. This is a little bit of repetitive stuff, but it's just, you know, I do think there might be an interesting relationship between, you know, the evidence that disagreements gives us and maybe statistical evidence as you kind of encounter people that like slowly lower your credence, or you could think about it in like a pessimistic meta-induction way, like given how many other philosophical theories there are, the probability that yours is correct is quite low. And then I again, when we should give up our philosophical views will depend on whether the Lockean thesis is true, and then kind of your background story about rational belief and rational credence. So sorry that was fast. I didn't want to go too over. I end up in the actual talk always going longer than the practice. So I'm gonna end it there. And yeah, thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. See, how do I stop sharing? Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
So, go ahead, Paul. Oh, no, it's all right. So Francesco and Sophia will provide joint comments in some fashion.
Yeah, so I'll share in the chat our comments, the handout for our comments. You should be able to see that. And I'll also share my screen with you so that you can see that on my screen. Okay. Screen, desktop. Okay, can you see my screen now? I think so, right? Okay, good. So I'll summarize briefly. Wait a second. Okay. So I'll briefly summarize what Liz has talked about over the past half hour, and then I'll go through the worries we have for the view that she presents. So Liz follows Buchak and argues that when we look at pure disagreement, we find ourselves into a dilemma. So we have, on the one hand, very good reasons and intuitions that support the idea that our opinions should change when we encounter a disagreeing peer. But on the other hand, it also seems like we have good reasons for thinking that our opinions should not change when we encounter a disagreeing peer, right? That's what Liz has talked about before. And she has argued that we can solve this dilemma if we are dualist. And dualism is this view where belief and credences come apart in a way that they are independent from each other from a metaphysical point of view. And why dualism allows us to solve this apparent dilemma where, well, the idea is that once you sever the connection between belief and credences, you make room for the following view that Liz is defending. 1 star, your credences should change. But 2 star, your beliefs should not change, right? And the reason why this view is productive and worth pursuing is that it captures our intuitions behind 1 and 2. It doesn't lead us to dilemmas regarding peer disagreement, or at least it allows us to solve this dilemma. But just that we are on board with a view. And the idea we and Sophia have is that we have a worry and a dilemma for the view that Liz is presenting. So even if we accept dualism, and we are going to accept dualism for the purpose of our commentary, even if you accept dualism between belief and credence, and you solve this dilemma in this way, you still have a lingering question. The question is, what is the normative relation between belief and credence? We know that a lot of smart people have defended something like the following, the Lockean thesis. You may rationally believe a proposition P if and only if your credence in P should be above a certain threshold value. Here, the should and the may are the should and may of rationality. And Liz's view seems to be saddled with a dilemma, and either she goes for something like the Lockean thesis, if not the Lockean thesis itself, or she rejects it. And we are going to explain why going for either of these options is not ideal. And I'm going to go through the first horn of the dilemma, and Sophia is going to present you the second horn of the dilemma. So let's say that you accept the Lockean thesis or something like it. So at least minimally, you have to think about the following conditional. You may rationally believe P only if your credence in P is above a certain threshold value. Some people think this is the necessity direction of the Lockean thesis. So at least that. If you accept something like that, then the claim that you should remain steadfast in your belief and at the same time be conciliatory as far as your credences go seem to lead to inconsistencies. Why? So if you disagree with your peer in a strong enough way, then your credences should change, and they should change dramatically. So let's say you had a credence 0.9 in a certain proposition, and you encounter a peer that disagrees with you that has a very low credence in that proposition, let's say 0.1. If splitting the difference is what you should do, you should go to 0.5, or perhaps you should do some other things. But the point is that no matter what the view is, you should decrease dramatically your credence in P when you encounter such strong disagreement, or when you encounter iterated disagreements with your peers. But then by the Lockean thesis, you should also be required to give up your own belief in P. And so belief and the normativity of belief would then appear to piggyback on the normativity of credence, right? But this is not something that you should do if Liz is right, because if Liz is right, you should not change your belief when you encounter a disagreeing peer. So how do you square these two things? We think then it's not true that you should always remain steadfast in your belief when you encounter a disagreeing peer. And so 1 star, 2 star, and the Lockean thesis, that is Liz's view and the Lockean thesis, are inconsistent. So to try and be charitable to Liz, we see in the paper that she has shared with us that she concedes that sometimes upon modifying your credences, you would also have to change your beliefs. Specifically, she talks about cases of iterated disagreements. And she says something like the following: you wouldn't change your beliefs because of your disagreement, but you would do so because of reasons of coherence or something like that. And we don't find this to be particularly persuasive. And the reason why we don't is that you wouldn't have had an incoherent set of exhaustive states if not because of the disagreement, if you had not encountered a disagreeing peer. So the reason why you are incoherent when it comes to the beliefs and the credences you have is because of the disagreement with your peer. And so we don't see that this is a persuasive mode. And so this is the conclusion of the first horn. Sometimes when you encounter a disagreeing peer, if the Lockean thesis is right, you should also change your beliefs in addition to your credences. And I'm going to let Sophia present the second horn of this dilemma. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
So to continue with the commentary, of course, there's also a second horn of this dilemma. And on the second horn of the dilemma, one would opt to reject the Lockean thesis, but doing so also immediately seems to lead to some problems. So if we allow that belief and credence may be completely independent of one another, it seems that we open the door to allowing that some rather odd combinations of doxastic attitudes may be rational. So it then seems that we could end up in a situation where in the face of disagreement, one could end up with permissible or even obligatory sets of doxastic attitudes that seem rather odd or even plain irrational. So for instance, you might start out with a relatively high credence and as well as the belief that Trump is going to win the election. But then you might encounter lots of peers who tell you that Biden will win the election. Then if your peer is perhaps extremely certain that Biden will win, such that you have very strong disagreement, or if you have repeated disagreements with peers who tell you that Biden will win, you might have to shift your credence quite a lot. And you might then eventually end up in a situation in which you ought to have a very high credence that Biden will win the election, but at the same time, you ought to be steadfast in your belief, and so you still ought to believe that Biden will not win. So to sum up, if it's the case that one should be steadfast in one's belief, but modify one's credence, one might end up in a situation where one ought to have a very low credence in P, but one still ought to believe P, or vice versa. But intuitively, this seems quite irrational. And I also think it's more than just an intuition that this is irrational. So as Jackson also mentions in her presentation, the role of credence is to track changes in our evidential situation. So the fact that we have adjusted our credences in response to the disagreement seems like a success in understanding the weight of the evidence and or the probabilities. But then the fact that we have then not adjusted our beliefs accordingly seems like a failure to adjust one's belief to match the evidence. So that's the dilemma. And then the question is, of course, can we somehow avoid this dilemma? And Jackson explores possible weakenings of our view. So on the handout, we have put what she terms the weakest view. And on the weakest view, one's credences should change when encountering a disagreeing epistemic peer, but one may hold on to one's beliefs at the core of one's web of belief when encountering a disagreeing epistemic peer. So the first thing to note is that the weakened view does not actually change anything with respect to our credences. So what we have termed 1 double star is actually identical to 1 star. So we can ignore that bit for now. But 2 double star is actually significantly weaker than 2 star. And it's weaker in 2 respects. So firstly, it's weaker because instead of an obligation to be steadfast in one's belief in the face of disagreement, one is, according to 2 double star, merely permitted to be steadfast. So one must not remain steadfast in one's belief, but one is permitted to remain steadfast. And this is therefore weaker. Secondly, 2 star star is also weaker because it reduces the scope of the beliefs that it applies to. So instead of applying to all the beliefs, the dualist view of disagreement, if we may call it that, now only speaks about core beliefs. So the question is then, will this weaker view help us to avoid the horns of the dilemma that we have spelled out? And unfortunately, it seems to us that it won't. So firstly, it doesn't help with the first horn, because by the Lockean thesis, one's credence in P should dip below the threshold value. It is no longer true that one is permitted to hold on to one's belief in P. And so this directly contradicts 2 double star. And if we look at the second horn, this is also still going to be an issue, because it seems that restricting the relevant propositions to those at the core of one's web of belief does not make those odd combinations of doxastic attitudes seem any less odd or any more rational. So firstly, is of course a bit unclear which beliefs exactly are intended to count as core. But I mean, it seems quite plausible that beliefs about, for example, the nature of reality would count as core. And then we can imagine that, for example, one encounters a large number of peers who are convinced by Nick Bostrom's argument that we live in a simulation. And then even if one starts up with the belief that we do not live in a simulation, it then might seem that we want to raise our credence in this proposition quite significantly, such that we want to have a very high credence that we live in a simulation. But then on the dualist picture, it seems that one might then at the same time be allowed to hold on to one's belief that one does not live in a simulation. And so we could end up in a situation where Somebody is very confident that we live in a simulation, or has a very high credence that we live in a simulation, but at the same time believes that we don't. And just because this belief is core, so to speak, this does not, at least on our view, make it sound any less odd. So it's not clear that the weakened view could help us avoid this dilemma. Anyway, perhaps Liz has something more to say about this that we have missed. Anyway, that's all we had, and we're of course very curious to hear Liz's thoughts about this. Thanks.
So I'll stop sharing my screen now, I guess.
All right, I have actually one more slide. Yeah, those are great comments. Thank you guys so much. Really, really appreciate it. And I think they're spot on. Really, you push back in a lot of very good places. How do I do this? Sorry. Okay. Oops. Okay, so yes, I like said, thank you both very much. Excellent comments. Really enjoyed it. I think this is something I'm going to want to think about for both of the papers actually that I'm working on. So I think you've pushed back in very good places. So basically, what they've done is they've presented my view with its own dilemma. And what I guess how I want to respond is, I actually think there are things we can say about either horn that make it less bad of a horn. So I don't necessarily want to take one horn or the other, but just talk a little bit about each one, and then say some things that I think make it not seem so bad, or make it not lead to like a contradiction at the worst. So the first horn is that if the Lockean thesis is true, the problem is supposed to be that then we can't maintain our beliefs in response to strong disagreement, because when we get strong disagreement, our credence will dip below the threshold, and then we'll have to give up our beliefs. Okay, so I guess just two things to note here, and I also want to say too, like, this response isn't necessarily exhaustive either. A lot of this stuff is just stuff I want to think more about, so I don't necessarily take this to. I still think your argument has a lot of weight, and is something I need to think more about for a while. But here's kind of what I'm thinking. So the first response is, I think what will happen to our credences in response to disagreement and in response to strong disagreement does partially depend on exactly how we're updating our credences in response to disagreement. And I don't necessarily want to commit to a particular updating rule here. So I don't necessarily think splitting the difference is always going to be the best. That leads to actually failures of commutativity, where the order in which you encounter peers changes the credence you end up having in the end. And so I think